Hello and welcome to the third episode of Spoiler Spotlight. Lots of goodies in this episode, so let's get started. First, let's start with a little riddle. What happens if you combine a Zephyr Sprite with Spirit Away? Well, apparently you get Hypnotic Siren, a 1/1 flyer for 1 mana, but it's also an enchantment creature with Bestow, and it bestows for 7 mana. And you can control the creature you bestow, so you put this on your opponent's creature and it acts like a mind control, or in this case more like a Spirit Away, only giving +1/+1 and flying instead of +2/+2, but you get the idea. This might see some play in the mono blue devotion decks just because it's a 1/1 flyer for 1 that can attack and get you a card with Bident of Thassa in play, and in the late game it has some other applications, so a cool card. I like the design and the art is pretty cool as well. The next card on our list is the third god from Journey Into Nyx revealed so far, and that's Kruphix, God of Horizons. A strange card for sure, I'll give you time to read it if you haven't already, but basically this means if you have spare mana, you can save it up in the Kruphix bank, and then whenever you want to cast a Giant Sphinx's Revelation, you can cash in all your spare mana for even more cards, and fittingly Kruphix gives you an unlimited hand size, which means those Sphinx's Revelations will be even more powerful. Prophet of Kruphix works extremely well with Kruphix himself for multiple reasons, not only because of the devotion, but the god is a creature once it's in your hand, so you can flash it in thanks to the Prophet, and the ability to untap your lands during your opponent's turn means you can have even more mana to put in your Kruphix bank, so you can get a lot of mana very quickly thanks to this combo. If having a lot of mana isn't good enough for you, but you want to have nearly infinite mana, well, let me introduce you to Dictate of Karamatra, the third card in the cycle of flash enchantments revealed so far, and this one doubles the mana produced by lands for you and your opponent. You can play this at the end step of your opponent's turn, so that you get the benefit first, and it combines very nicely with Kruphix himself, as you can put all your spare mana in the bank for future use. Of course, you can't simply jam all these 5 drops in the same deck and expect it to work. You will need some earlier acceleration to get to 5 mana, and you will need some good finishers that make use of all that spare mana, but I'm sure that there's a way to make it work. Let's step away from blue and green for a second and take a look at a red card. Eidolon of the Greatravel is a red enchantment creature for the casting cost of double red. It's a 2/2, and whenever a player casts a spell with converted mana cost of 3 or less, the Eidolon deals 2 damage to that player. So that includes yourself, which makes this card a little awkward to play in an aggressive red deck, where you have a lot of cheap creatures, because you'll end up dealing a lot of damage to yourself. But the important thing about this card, I think, is the casting cost of double red, which means we'll have some replacement cards once Return to Ravnica rotates out of standard, to have some early devotion for the red decks that rely on devotion. But I could see this work in a mid-range deck where you want to punish people for playing cheap cards. But I'm sure there will be a place for this card at some point. Let's take a look at this next card, which is Worst Fears. The name is pretty accurate. For the low cost of 7 and a black, you control target player during that player's next turn, so you get to look at their hand, draw a card, make the worst attacks possible for that player, and you waste their removal spells on their own creatures, or waste their counter spells, make sure their mana is all tapped. And if you happen to be in a competitive event, you can even look at their sideboard, so that's pretty cool. Unfortunately, you can't make that player concede, that would be a little too powerful. And once all that happens, it's back to your turn, where you can hopefully finish things off. But yeah, 7 and a black, pretty expensive for standard, so the only way I see to make this card work at the moment is with Oracle of Bones, but that's pretty far-fetched, so good luck with that. I don't want to silence the believers of the Worst Fears combo, but our next card is named Silence the Believers, so that just happened. I do think this card is pretty powerful. For 2 and double black you get to exile a creature and all auras attached to that creature. So that means that those Eidolons of Countless Battles or Heralds of Torment won't be a problem anymore. And I even forgot to mention that this card has Strive, so if you have some spare mana, you can target multiple creatures with this. So yeah, I think this card will see a lot of play. Maybe not 4 copies in every deck, but the fact that it can even exile active gods means that this card has a lot of applications. Spite of Mogus deals damage equal to the number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard to target creature, so you can't target your opponent with this unless you happen to have a Porous Reckoner in play, in which case you can target the Reckoner and redirect the damage to the opponent. And this card could go in the same deck as Spellheart Chimera, where it also counts the instants and sorceries in your graveyard, but I doubt this will see a lot of play. So let's move on to the next card, which is Pheres-band Warchief, a 3/3 centaur for 4 mana. It has Vigilance and Trample, and it happens to be a Centaur Lord, giving other centaurs you control +1/+1, Vigilance and Trample. So let's not forget about those Centaur tokens from Return to Ravnica, Call of the Conclave being a prime example, and Courser of Crofix, an awesome creature, also happens to be a Centaur. The fact that this Warchief grants Vigilance combines very well with Mutavault, which would also be a Centaur, so you can attack with it just by paying 1 mana and keeping it untapped. So nice combos there, probably still a casual deck for Standard, but a cool deck nonetheless. There's not a ton of reanimation going on in Standard right now, but perhaps Ritual of the Returned will change that, because for 4 mana you can exile a creature from your graveyard at instant speed and put a zombie token into play with power and toughness equal to the creature you just exiled. The biggest creature you can exile right now in Standard would be Worldspine Worm, but it gets a little tricky because Worldspine Worm shuffles itself back into your library, so you would have to do this in response to the trigger in order to get a 15/15 zombie token. I would like to point out that you can exile the gods with this and get a pretty substantial token into play, because the gods in your graveyard are considered creatures. If you want to try this card in Modern instead of Standard, your best bet is probably Death Shadow, as it also combos with Varolz from the Dragon's Maze set, so there might be a deck there. I think the most important card revealed so far is Mana Confluence. It's a land that taps for any color of mana at the cost of 1 life, and it's very important fixing for those aggressive decks that play more than 1 color, because they can't afford to play the temples because they come into play tapped, and those aggressive decks don't really care about taking a bit of damage in the early game. It will be interesting to see what decks end up playing this card, but I think we can exclude most control decks because they can't afford to take damage of their lands repeatedly, and they're happy enough to play the temples that give them scry. Tapping this land for Underworld connections will only lose you 1 life of the Underworld connections and not 1 life from the confluence, unlike a card like City of Brass would do. And of course, if you have a Nightveil Spectre in a mono-black Devotion deck, this Mana Confluence will be pretty useful to cast the spells you exile. Kiora's Dismissal is pretty narrow, but just because it's so narrow and powerful at what it does, it might see some sideboard play in mono blue, because it can return Detention Spheres and enchantment creatures, and it also has a Strive for 1 blue, so for every blue you pay extra, you get to target an additional enchantment. So a pretty cool card and might see some sideboard play. Launch the Fleet is another card with Strive, and for each creature you target, you get a 1/1 white attacking soldier creature token into play if that creature attacks. So the obvious deck this would fit in is a white weenie type deck with a lot of small creatures, where you can use this as a finisher to overwhelm the board. And it's a little awkward that it doesn't combo quite well with Phalanx Leader, in that if you target Phalanx Leader with this, the tokens you get won't get the +1/+1 counter, but if you have multiple Launch the Fleets, then it does combo well with the Phalanx Leader, or basically any heroic creature, as the Strive cost is very low for just 1 colorless. A Crone Hoplite also combos very well with this, as the Hoplite will get +X +0, and double that if you launch the fleet successfully. Krufix's Insight is a nice draw engine for the green enchantment deck, so the obvious deck would be the Eidolon of Blossoms deck, but it would also work in the green-black graveyard deck where Night Howlers are important, as this would not only fuel your graveyard but also look for these Night Howlers. And today's last card is Interpret the Signs, an expensive sorcery that lets you scry for 3, reveal the top card, and you get to draw cards equal to the revealed card's mana cost. A nice combo with this card are the split cards from Dragon's Maze, as the converted mana cost of split cards is the sum of both halves. So for turn and burn it would be 5, for a card like Backcall it would be 8. So drawing 8 cards for 6 mana is not a bad deal, and the fact that you get to scry for 3 means you get to look for the card you want. Given its high casting cost and the fact that it's a sorcery and not an instant, we probably won't see this card in Standard, but maybe in Block Constructed. I want to thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and stay tuned for the next one.